meeting lasted 43 minutes. That detail matters because 43 minutes was how long it took the deputy commanding officer of a brigade combat team that had been fighting in Diyala province for 4 months to explain to a room of 14 staff officers and 2 British liaison personnel why what the British were proposing was not just impractical, but operationally negligent. He had maps, he had slides, he had satellite imagery of the bridge complex at the center of the argument, each approach route color-coded, each identified fighting position marked with a red symbol that the brigade's intelligence cell had spent the previous 72 hours cataloging. He pointed at those symbols and he counted them out loud. 16 prepared defensive positions, 11 assessed at the northern approach, 6 more covering the riverbank to the east, 3 on the elevated ground to the west, where a machine gun emplacement had been active for 11 consecutive days. He pointed at the enemy strength figure, between 60 and 80 armed personnel with established early warning networks, vehicle-borne IED capability, and a command structure that had survived 3 previous coalition attempts to disrupt it. He pointed at the weekly attack statistics, 8 coalition soldiers killed in the preceding 14 days in the immediate operational area. Then he said the words that would define the remaining years of his career from that moment forward. You cannot clear that network with fewer than 60 soldiers and a planning horizon shorter than 6 days. A deliberate operation, properly resourced with dedicated air assets, medevac pre-positioned, and a cordon force large enough to prevent any leakage from the objective area. Anything shorter than that is not a plan. It is an assumption dressed up as one. The British officer sitting across the table said nothing. He was a major, lean, and unremarkable looking in the way that the regiment produces as reliably as it produces everything else. The quality of not announcing itself. He took no notes. He looked at the maps for a moment, then looked at the American colonel and said quietly, and without any particular emphasis, that he understood, and that if the brigade wanted to run a 6-day deliberate operation, the task force had no objection. He did not say what the task force planned to do instead. The meeting was over. 31 hours later, at approximately 3:15 in the morning local time, a U.S. Army captain assigned as intelligence liaison to the task force Black Planning Cell walked into the Brigade Tactical Operations Center and found the duty officer standing at the digital map display with an expression that suggested he was processing information for which he did not yet have a category. The captain asked what had happened. The duty officer pointed at the map, the symbols that had been read at the start of the previous day, the icons denoting confirmed enemy presence around the bridge complex that the deputy commanding officer had counted out loud, had been replaced. In the blue notation that the system used for confirmed captures and eliminations, 14 separate markers were now distributed across the target area, not clustered, spread systematically, as if someone had worked through the network the way a reader works through a document, removing one line at a time, leaving nothing unaddressed. The captain looked at the screen. His first thought was a data entry error. His second thought, arriving in the same breath, was that it was not. What you are about to hear is the story of how a force numbering, at its operational tip, 12 men in 4 civilian vehicles, without a single piece of organic fire support, without dedicated helicopter assets, without a conventional cordon, and operating against a network that a fully resourced brigade combat team had assessed as requiring 60 soldiers and 6 days, achieved its objective in 6 hours and 11 minutes. But to understand why that number carries the weight it does, you have to understand what Diyala province was in the spring of 2007, and why a river crossing in a country most Americans could not find on a map had become the most important piece of terrain in the eastern Iraq insurgency. Diyala province sits northeast of Baghdad, in the crook of the river that shares its name, a region of date palm groves, fork irrigation canals, an agricultural flatland that runs from the Iranian border westward until the Diyala River joins the Tigris just north of the capital. In 2007, it was one of the most violent places on the surface of the earth. Al-Qaeda in Iraq had identified Diyala as a critical operational fallback following the intensifying pressure on their Baghdad networks from the combined special operations surge that General Stanley McChrystal was driving through the Joint Special Operations Command headquarters at Balad. The province offered a specific combination of advantages that made it strategically irreplaceable to the organization. Porous eastern borders with Iran, through which weapons, explosives, precursors, and Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps-trained operatives could move with a freedom that no coalition surveillance architecture had yet effectively interrupted. A river valley geography that created natural movement corridors, agricultural and dispersed and populated with civilians who looked identical from altitude to the insurgents moving among them, and a Sunni rural population that had been systematically terrorized into silence by an AQI campaign of targeted assassination that had, by early 2007, killed over 300 local officials, police recruits, tribal elders, and any civilian who had demonstrated any cooperation with coalition forces whatsoever. The bridge complex in question, which this account will not name specifically to protect assets that remain in place, controlled the primary crossing over the Diyala River at a geographic choke point where the provincial road network funneled all vehicle traffic across a single accessible point for a distance of approximately 38 kilometers in either direction. Everything that moved between AQY's western supply network in Anbar province and its active operations in Diyala and the northeastern Baghdad belts passed through or within 3 kilometers of this location. Vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices assembled in the farming communities to the west of the river were transported through the corridor on their way to deployment in Baghdad markets, government buildings, and Shia mosques. Foreign fighters transiting from Syria through Anbar continued east through this geography. The bomb-making components, the ammonium nitrate, the pentaerythritol tetranitrate, the copper plates for the explosively formed penetrators supplied through Iranian Quds force networks, all of it moved through this axis. Coalition intelligence had understood this for 6 months. The difficulty was not identification, it was that the network controlling the crossing was not a fixed military installation that could be neutralized with a strike or a conventional cordon. It was a human structure, a web of cell commanders, logistics coordinators, couriers, safe house managers, early warning lookouts, and weapons custodians dispersed across 4 villages and 2 urban districts in a radius of approximately 12 kilometers around the objective. You could not destroy the crossing by blowing up the bridge. The network would have boats and pontoon alternatives functional within 48 hours based on historical precedent in the area. You destroyed the crossing by destroying the network that made it function. And to do that, the deputy commanding officer argued, you needed 6 days, 60 soldiers, and a deliberate operation plan that no reasonable person could argue with given the intelligence picture available. He was not wrong. He was applying the doctrinal framework he had been trained in across a decade of conventional military service, a framework that was precisely correct for the type of warfare it had been designed for and dangerously incomplete for the specific problem now in front of him. The British officer who said nothing in that meeting had been applying a different framework since before the deputy commanding officer had his first conversation about counterinsurgency doctrine, one developed not in classrooms at Fort Leavenworth but across 3 decades of operational experience in the specific conditions that Diyala province, for all its brutality, almost exactly replicated. The streets of Belfast in the 1970s and 1980s, where a surveillance and targeting system refined across 2 generations of operators had learned to find and remove specific individuals from specific networks without triggering the mass alert that conventional operations invariably produced. The rubber plantations of Malaya in the 1950s, where 4-man patrols operating for weeks without resupply had dismantled communist terrorist infrastructure that full battalions of infantry could not locate. The mountains of Oman in the 1970s, where a handful of soldiers working with locally recruited irregulars had defeated a Soviet-backed insurgency that threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz. Each of these campaigns had contributed something specific to the institutional knowledge that the Major brought into that planning meeting. The framework he was operating from was not a 6-day deliberate plan. It was a targeting sequence, and the targeting sequence had already been built. The intelligence that drove the 6-hour operation had been accumulating for 11 days before the meeting. The Task Force Black Intelligence Cell had developed a network diagram of the AQI structure controlling the Diyala crossing with a level of precision the brigade's own intelligence product could not match. 2 human agents, recruited and managed by SAS officers, were operating inside the target network itself in service roles. The agents' reporting, combined with signals intelligence and pattern-of-life analysis from aerial surveillance, had produced a network diagram naming 9 key individuals and assessing 4 as simultaneously locatable at their known locations on any given night. What the Major had told the meeting was entirely truthful. The task force had no objection to the brigade's 6-day plan. He simply intended to do his own work in the time available. The 12 men who were about to execute 4 operations in 6 hours were professionals at the sustained peak of a system built over 65 years to produce exactly this specific human capability. They were the finished product of a selection and training process designed to identify and develop the specific individual who functions better under total uncertainty and sustained mortal threat than he does in any comfortable environment. The clothing they wore when they drove out of the task force compound at 2100 hours looked like what any group of men in western Iraq might be wearing that evening. The capability underneath it was something the six-day plan had no framework for. The plan that the British intelligence cell had developed was not complex in its architecture. Its complexity was entirely in the intelligence that had made it possible. 4 operations, each targeting a specific individual identified by name through human source reporting and confirmed by signals intelligence, each designed to be completed and exploited before the network's early warning and dispersal procedures could respond to the previous strike. The sequencing was not random. It followed the logical structure of the network itself, beginning with a node in the logistics function whose position gave him visibility of a wide range of the network's membership without occupying a command position that would trigger an immediate leadership succession response, and moving through the structure toward the command nodes as each preceding operation produced the intelligence required to locate the next. The entire sequence had been planned from the product of 11 days of intelligence development and was executable in its current form only because of those 11 days. Without the human sources, without the signals intelligence, without the pattern of life analysis that had located 4 of the network's key members to specific addresses with assessed probability scores above 60%, there was no 6-hour option. There was only the 6-day plan. So the intelligence was not better than what the brigade had access to because the British were smarter. It was better because it had been built differently over a longer timescale, through a methodology that prioritized precision over volume and human understanding over technical collection. The SAS officers managing the human sources inside the network had not recruited them last week. They had been developing the relationships that produced those recruits for months before the specific targeting requirement had been established. That kind of intelligence cannot be generated on demand. It is grown, slowly and carefully, by people trained in the craft of managing human beings who are risking their lives for reasons that are rarely straightforward and always require careful maintenance. The British brought this capability to Diyala because it was the capability the regiment had been refining since its Northern Ireland campaigns. Every IRA arms cache that the SAS had found, every PIRA cell member that had been lifted from a Belfast safe house in the 1980s and 1990s, had been found and lifted through some version of this methodology. The doctrine was not new in 2007. It was 60 years old. Iraq was simply its latest application. The first operation departed at 2114 hours. 4 operators in a civilian vehicle drove toward the first target location. The target was a logistics coordinator identified 11 days earlier as the network's primary materials handler. Assessed probability of presence, 73%. The team reached the compound wall in 14 minutes. Son opened the gate in 11 seconds and secured the target in the second room in 4 seconds. He was removed to the vehicle. Total time from vehicle dismount to remount, 12 minutes and 7 seconds. The vehicle was moving before the occupants of the first room had fully understood what had occurred. The mobile phone was transmitting its data to the task force intelligence cell via encrypted relay within 3 minutes of the team's departure from the compound. 2 signals intelligence specialists working at the task force command node began the exploitation process immediately. The handset's most recent communications revealed 11 separate contact numbers, with call histories concentrated in a 48-hour window preceding the previous Friday's IED attack on a coalition patrol, a pattern that matched the pre-attack communication signature the cell had documented from previous operations. 3 of the numbers were already in the database. 2 were new. One of the new numbers had made or received 11 calls in the preceding 72 hours to a handset that the SIGINT architecture had previously associated with the movement facilitation function of the network, the role responsible for managing accommodation for foreign fighters in transit. The intelligence cell had a location assessment for this handset's operator. It had been improbable for 6 days. The phone exploitation, combined with 2 items recovered from the compound during a rapid site search conducted by the 4th operator while the primary was being secured, a notebook containing a schedule of dates and locations written in a notation system the cell had seen in previous Diyala operations, and a sealed envelope that would take 20 minutes to fully read but whose visible contents included a hand-drawn network diagram, elevated the location assessment from probable to confirmed. The second operation launched at 2309 hours, 115 minutes after the first had departed. The second operation targeted a different location. A 4-man element secured the target through envelope positioning as he attempted to reach the rear exit. The evidence recovery produced a USB drive sealed in waterproof protection. The drive was encrypted but decrypted in 19 minutes using a password the target had carelessly stored as a contact label. Inside was a detailed planning document for the network's operations, including 4 weapons cache locations, 2 safe house addresses, the commander's mobile number and schedule, and a meeting record naming 2 individuals the task force had been seeking for 7 weeks. The intelligence officer officer described it as the network handing them a map of itself. The third operation launched at 0122, targeting the 4 weapons cache locations identified in the drive document. Two two-man elements moved simultaneously to separate locations, working in parallel through the night to clear all 4 sites before the network could respond to the pattern of what was happening. The caches contained, in aggregate, 11 vehicle-borne IED trigger assemblies, 140 kilograms of homemade explosive in sealed plastic containers, 6 RPG-7 launchers with 42 rounds, 14 AK pattern rifles, and a laptop computer. The laptop's eventual analysis would take 4 days and produce intelligence that fed 11 subsequent operations. But even in the immediate exploitation at the Task Force command node, its contents were sufficient to confirm the location assessments for the 4th operation's targets, and to identify a 5th node in the network that the targeting sequence had not previously included. 2 individuals found in proximity to one of the cache sites were detained as suspected custodians. No shots were fired during the 3rd operation. All 4 cache sites were cleared and sealed within the night. The 4th and final operation launched at 0247 and targeted the 2 safe house locations from the drive document. The first safe house was empty on entry. It had been vacated recently. Tea glasses still retained warmth. Discarded food had not been present in the aerial imagery from 30 hours earlier. The network's dispersal procedures had been triggered. The question was how thoroughly the second safe house was occupied. A 4-man entry team cleared the building in 8 minutes and 40 seconds, engaging 2 armed individuals in the ground floor rooms who presented firearms immediately on the team's entry, and detaining 3 others on the upper floor, including a foreign fighter assessed from documents found on his person as a Saudi national in transit, the safe house manager, and a 3rd individual carrying a sealed document wallet whose contents, when opened, revealed a complete roster of the foreign fighter pipeline operating through the eastern Diyala corridor from the Syrian border to the Baghdad belt staging areas, with names, approximate timelines, and contact information for the border facilitators on the Syrian side. The safe house manager was carrying a phone whose most recent message, received 40 minutes before the team's entry, was from a number the signal's intelligence cell identified as belonging to the network's operational commander. The message contained 12 words. The translation was approximate but unambiguous. "Stay where you are. Do not move. We do not yet know what is happening." The operational commander did not know what was happening because what was happening did not fit within any threat model the network had constructed. Their entire operational security architecture had been built around the assumption that a coalition targeting operation against their network would look like what coalition targeting operations had always looked like. Vehicles, helicopters overhead, the electronic signature of active communications jamming, on the cordon of soldiers that preceded any substantial ground action. What had happened instead was that 4 small teams had moved through their operational area in the dark, without any of those signatures, finding and removing specific individuals from specific locations in a sequence so precisely calibrated to the network's internal structure that by the time any survivor understood they were under attack, the attack was already over. The operational commander's message, those 12 words transmitted at 0235, was the most significant piece of evidence produced by the entire operation. Not because of what it said, because of what it revealed about what the network did not understand. They did not know what was happening. A network that had survived 3 previous coalition operations, that had successfully dispersed and reconstituted each time a conventional force had attempted to disrupt it, was unable to comprehend the threat that was now inside it, because the threat they had prepared for and the threat they had just experienced were separated by 65 years of institutional learning that had produced a different kind of soldier entirely. At 0315, the final team returned to the task force forward operating base. 12 operators, 4 operations, 6 hours and 11 minutes of elapsed time from the departure of the first vehicle to the return of the last. 9 key members of the AQI network controlling the Diyala crossing removed from the battlefield. 5 captured alive and transferred to a detention facility. 4 engaged and killed during operations where they presented armed resistance. 4 weapons caches containing sufficient explosive for 11 vehicle-borne IEDs seized and secured. 2 safe houses cleared, a foreign fighter pipeline document, a network command roster, an encrypted planning document, and a collection of mobile phone data that would take the intelligence cell 3 days to fully exploit, but would ultimately feed a cascade of follow-on operations that extended across the following 6 weeks. The network that the deputy commanding officer had assessed as a 6-day problem was operationally defunct before the sun came up. The early warning system that had defeated 3 previous conventional operations had not sounded because there had been no warning to give. The dispersal procedures that had protected the network's leadership through every previous coalition action had been activated too late to function because the sequence had moved faster than any previous operation the network had encountered. The bridge complex was clear. The logistics corridor was severed. The operational commander's 12 words sat in an evidence bag at the task force command node, the last transmission of a network that had ceased to exist as a functional organization in the course of a single night. SAS, the U.S. Army captain who had walked into the Brigade Tactical Operations Center at 0400 hours and found the duty officer staring at the digital map, had watched all of this from the task force command node on the encrypted communications net. He had been awake for 26 consecutive hours. He had watched the intelligence cell process the phone from the first operation while the first team was still driving back. He had watched the USB drive's contents come up on the exploitation screen and had understood within 60 seconds what those contents meant for the remaining operations. He later described those 60 seconds as the moment he realized that the planning meeting had not been a disagreement about methodology. It had been a conversation between two professional soldiers who were each looking at the same problem through frameworks so different that they were not, in the most important sense, discussing the same problem at all. The Brigadier General who commanded the corps-level operation received his briefing at 0600. He reviewed the capture and exploitation log. He examined the network diagram that the task force intelligence cell had constructed over 11 days, and which was now almost entirely annotated in the red notation that the cell used for confirmed neutralizations. He listened to the intelligence officer's summary of the USB drive contents and the cascade of follow-on targeting opportunities they had generated. Then he sat in silence for what the officers present later estimated as slightly under a full minute. And then he said the words that have survived in the operational memory of two nations' special operations communities for the 18 years since. I saw the SAS do in 6 hours what we'd been ordered to do in 6 days. He was not providing a formal assessment. He was not offering praise in the institutional sense. He was a senior military officer making an observation about something he had just witnessed that was so far outside the parameters of his operational expectations that he needed to put it into language in order to process it, and the language he reached for was the most direct comparison available to him. 6 days, 6 hours. The gap between those two numbers was not a question of effort or resources or tactical sophistication in the conventional sense. It was a question of what happens when 65 years of an institution's accumulated learning about how to find and remove specific people from specific networks is concentrated into 12 operators working from 11 days of precisely targeted intelligence in a 6-hour window in the dark. The deputy commanding officer's 6-day plan was the right answer to the problem as it existed before those 11 days of intelligence development. The 6-hour reality was the task force's answer to the same problem, and the difference between them was not luck, was not the particular qualities of the individuals involved, was not even primarily the intelligence, though without the intelligence neither was possible. The difference was a professional culture that had been built around this specific methodology for longer than most of the soldiers in that briefing room had been alive. The full text of the Brigadier General's observation was classified as part of the after-action review that documented the Diyala operation. The review itself was stamped secret no-fawn at its classification header and distributed on a need-to-know basis so restricted that fewer than 25 individuals in the entire coalition were authorized to receive it. The specific intelligence about the human sources whose reporting had made the targeting sequence possible was removed from the distributable version entirely and held in a separate annex whose readership was limited to the Director of Special Forces in London and his designated counterpart at JSOC headquarters. This classification was not punitive, and it was not motivated by institutional embarrassment, though the numbers it contained were the kind of numbers that institutional embarrassment, if left unmanaged, would eventually cause problems around. It was protective. The sources were still active. The methodology was still in use in other theaters. So, the specific mechanics of how the intelligence had been developed and how the targeting sequence had been constructed were operational details that could not be allowed into a wider distribution without risking the architecture that had produced them. The Brigadier General's comment survived because he had made it in a room with more than 20 people in it, and words spoken in rooms of that size do not remain confined regardless of what the classification system would prefer. They move through the coalition's special operations community in the way that things true enough to be unarguable always move, not in any document, in the mouths of people who had been present and could not find a reason to keep them quiet. The deputy commanding officer completed his tour and returned home 4 months after the Diyala operation. He knew, as every professional soldier understands, that the assessment he had made in that planning meeting was not wrong. It was the correct application of the doctrine he had been trained in to the intelligence picture that was available to him at the time he made it. The fact that a different intelligence picture, developed through a different methodology over 11 days, made a different operation possible did not retroactively make his assessment an error. What it made, it was a data point in a longer argument about what kind of investment produces what kind of military capability, an argument that his service and the British service had been conducting, largely in private, since the SAS first began demonstrating its particular approach to this kind of warfare in the post-war colonial campaigns. The 12 operators who ran 4 operations in 6 hours rotated out of theatre 6 weeks after the Diyala sequence. They were replaced by the next troop from the same squadron. They received no formal commendation for the 6-hour operation. The commendation process requires documentation, and the documentation was classified. Their names are not in any public record connected to this operation. The SAS does not maintain public records of operational achievements because operational achievements, in the regiment's institutional culture, are not trophies. They are results. The result of the Diyala operation was a 67% reduction in vehicle-borne IED attacks in the Eastern Corridor in the 6 weeks following, a measurement that appears in coalition intelligence assessments compiled from attack rate data and which requires no classified context to be read for what it represents. Dozens of people were not killed by those bombs. The bridge was clear. The network was gone. The foreign fighter pipeline through the Eastern Crossing was disrupted for a minimum of 2 months, while survivors attempted to reconstruct operational security from scratch without the personnel, the documentation, or the infrastructure that had underpinned it. The after-action review that contains the Brigadier General's comment was partially declassified in 2019 as part of a Freedom of Information release following a journalist's request for documentation related to coalition special operations in Iraq. The released version is 47 pages long. 31 of those pages are substantially redacted. The operational comparison appears on page 47, near the end of the document, in a section that contains the Brigadier General's direct assessment of the operation's strategic significance. Most of the paragraph around it is black. The sentence itself is visible. I saw the SAS do in 6 hours what we'd been ordered to do in 6 days. The pages that contain the explanation of how are still dark.